He destroys the propaganda in support of Israel's illegal and unprovoked assault on Iran. I spoke to Pársi. He's an Iranian-Swedish right-wing analyst. He was the former president of the National Iranian-American Council and the co-founder of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I start by asking him about his assessment of where things currently stand with Israel's assault.
Well, I think we are in a situation in which within 24, 48 hours, the Israelis came back to the US and said, you know what, we promised you that all you needed to do is to give us a green light to do this, and we didn't need your help, but actually we want you to come in and take over the operations and finish the job, because at the end of the day, the Israelis started something they knew they could not finish. And I don't think that was a coincidence. I just didn't think it was going to happen within 24 hours. The Israelis have been hit hard back by the Iranians. Clearly, Iran is not a match for Israel technologically. Israel has air control over Tehran and much of Iran right now, which is devastating for the Iranians. But this is not the same war as in which the Israelis are bombing refugees in camps. This is a war in which they're actually being struck back. And we saw that a very large number of Iranian missiles are penetrating Israel's air defenses. They have been testing new missiles. They've been exploring holes in the air defense systems of Israel. And yesterday, apparently, they only shot one missile and that one got through. So I think the Iranians are pacing themselves, preparing for a long war. And in that process are increasingly wearing down Israel's air defense systems. So this is going to be a very costly thing. And the Israelis are going to use that in order to try to push the US into that war. Now, whether Trump actually is moving towards diplomacy or whether this 2-week talk is just an effort to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security and then strike them in the midst of that remains to be seen. But I suspect that the Iranians are very, very suspicious.
What do you make of Israeli ministers saying after the attack, the strike on an Israeli hospital in the south, that this was a despicable war crime, which shows that the supreme leader of Iran needs to be taken out?
Well, the Israelis are pushing for the supreme leader to be taken out because they know that that will cause all-out war that will force the U.S. into the war. So whatever yet happens, they're going to constantly go back to that. In regards to the hit that apparently came close to the hospital, obviously hospitals are off limits. Now, it happens to be, which has been revealed, that the Israelis are putting all of their intelligence and military sites very close to hospitals. And in midst of civilian populations, etc. All the things that they accuse Hamas of doing, they're doing themselves. And Israelis are actually pointing that out on Western media. But I think the bigger picture here is that for the last year and a half, and even before that, but particularly in the last year and a half, the Israelis have waged a war against international law. They have deliberately tried to erase all norms around the use of force. And to a large extent, they succeeded because the Europeans now are endorsing and legitimizing what the Israelis are doing, not just turning a blind eye by actually explicitly endorsing it. But that is now coming to back and haunt Israel because they're no longer fighting a power that they're not just bombing refugees in camps any longer. So there's a bite back now. And we see that ultimately the establishment of these norms and these laws are actually for the better good of everyone. Because you can always end up being on the receiving end of these things. And now when you have destroyed these norms, you're paying the price for it.
A lot of the commentary, I mean, not it's coming from the Israeli government, but a lot of Western media outlets suggest the Islamic Republic is basically just a house of cards waiting to totter. And that Israeli strikes could just, the whole thing could come falling over, regime changes on the cards. This is all very weak. What do you think of that?
Look, this regime in Iran is very unpopular and one day it will fall. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, however. And I think you've seen a significant rallying around the flag phenomena in Iran and the population not rallying around the government as much as they're rallying around the country, which also was quite predictable. But I think there's something else going on here, which is a deliberate attempt to manufacture consent, to think that the Iranians are extremely weak, and that all that is needed is a little bit of a push and they will fall, and this is going to be a remarkable success for the Israelis. The utility of that narrative, which I find highly questionable, is that it reduces the likelihood of Trump shifting towards diplomacy, because why should he have diplomacy if he can just get the Iranians to surrender? And it increases the likelihood of Trump getting into the war, because if it's so easy, then why not do it and take credit for the final win? But in reality, the picture is much, much different, I would say. So for instance, take a look at how there was a bit of a lull in the number of missiles the Iranians lobbed at Israel for about 48 hours. There were several different explanations for this. One, yes, the Israelis have successfully targeted a lot of the Iranian launchers, which makes it more difficult for them to send large number of missiles. But there were also other factors at play. A, the Iranians were testing new missiles. B, they were testing the air defense systems to try to find better holes in it in order to increase the accuracy of their missiles. 3, they were holding off because they were playing a long game instead of throwing everything at once. All of those factors were part of the answer. The only factor you heard on mainstream media was the first one. The Israelis have been successful in taking out their air defense system. And this is part of the reason why I think all viewers have to be really clear. In a war, the first thing that dies is truth. And the amount of misinformation, disinformation, distraction that is now currently being aired on mainstream media is stunning. Not just on American, on Israeli, and on Iranian. Have to be suspicious of all of that, because these are attempts to manufacture consent towards a specific policy option. And in this case, it is the policy option of more war.
I mean, on that, in terms of misinformation, I mean, obviously Israel is nuclear armed. Iran isn't. No one actually is claiming Iran is nuclear armed. But Netanyahu, who has for the last 30 years claimed Iran is imminently going to get a nuclear weapon, we know Tulsi Gabbard, the US Director of National Intelligence appointed by Trump, said 3 months ago that the consensus of the intelligence community in the US is that it wasn't. What do you make of all this? What do you make of that, the whole pretext?
No, I think the pretext is laughable. It's weaker than it was during the invasion of Iraq. And also another thing that I think is very disturbing in all of this is the European reaction. European reaction after October 7th was that Israel has a right to defend itself. And then that just became bigger and bigger. It didn't matter what kind of war crimes or aggression Israel was pursuing. The Europeans kept on saying Israel has a right to defend itself, pointing back to October 7th, which was an attack on Israel. So on the surface of it, you can say, well, this is a reaction to October 7th. What are they pointing to now when they're starting all of their statements saying Israel has a right to defend itself? What was the Iranian attack that they were defending themselves against? There's neither an Iranian attack or an imminent Iranian attack that were about to occur. So what you're seeing is that the Europeans are debasing themselves. They're destroying the very norms and international law that has been at the bedrock of European security for the last couple of decades. And they're doing it for a war criminal in Tel Aviv who was wanted by the International Court of the ICC. To me, this is stunning. As someone who's grown up in Europe, to see how Europe has shifted from being, in the last couple of decades, a force that actually did everything it could to stand up against the Iraq war, to one that is now actually adding fuel to the fire and has become a destabilizing force in the world, at least key parts of Europe. There's still countries like Spain that are going in the opposite, in the right direction. But what I'm seeing coming out of the UK, out of France, out of Germany, is devastating for Europe itself.
I mean, it has succeeded, though, in deflecting the limited but growing pressure on Israel over Gaza.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think that's the reason why the Israelis did it necessarily. But, it definitely has shifted the narrative. We were starting to see that the Europeans started to become a little bit better on these issues, pushing back a little bit after the European publics were seeing that the Israelis were using starvation of children as a weapon of war. But nevertheless, that has shifted. But the larger picture is Europe has, by and large, lost its entire independence. It's becoming an appendix to the United States. And in this specific case, the United States is following Israel's lead. Europeans have to ask themselves the same thing, that an increasing number of Americans, particularly on the right, and this is a very interesting phenomenon, are asking themselves, how is this good for America? I'm stunned to see that there's so little conversation in Europe about how is this good for Europe.
What do you think the prospects of Trump entering the war? I mean, because at the moment it's, he's kind of teasing everyone. What do you think of the genuine prospects of US direct involvement?
I think the risk of that is still very high. Even the talk about potential moving towards diplomacy could be a ruse. It could be something that he's doing to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security. That's exactly what happened last week. He kept on talking about diplomacy. Talks were scheduled for Sunday. Everyone's guards was down. Every European diplomat I spoke to only talked about, do you think Israel will strike after Sunday? Instead, the Israelis struck on Friday. and took everyone by surprise, none more than the Iranians themselves, in which, frankly, criminal neglect by the Iranian military, in which their heads were actually sleeping in their apartments in Tehran with zero security measures. So after that, I think it's very difficult for the Iranians to trust this, but nevertheless, they would be foolish not to explore diplomacy, and I suspect that they will. But I think as part of all of this, we have to keep in mind that if you compare this to Iraq, in 2003, 71% of the American public favored the invasion of Iraq prior to the invasion. 91% of Republicans did. Now you have a situation in which 16% of Republicans are in favor of this, 20 or so percent of Americans in general, and more than 50% are against it. Back in 2003, it took about 2 years before Republicans were willing to speak out against the war. Now you have some of the key voices within the American First Movement, from Bannon to Tucker to others, screaming on top of their lungs even before the war has started. So the idea that this will be a political win for Trump, it never was for Bush at the end of the day, but that it could even in the short term be one, I don't see. And I think there's a tremendous amount of concern in Trump circles that he is about to destroy his presidency in the same manner that George W. Bush did with his.
Brilliant stuff, as ever, from Twitter Pársi. We've got so much more coverage to come on the war in Iran. And our promise, of course, is not to neglect the genocide in Gaza, which is exactly, of course, what the cheerleaders of the genocide want us to do. We've got interviews coming up with 2 doctors who served in Gaza during the genocide and their searing testimonies. So please brace yourself for that. Do share the video. Let's get the message out. Let's keep challenging the pro-genocide and pro-war media. You make all of this possible at patreon.com/OJ34. All of this is possible because of you. That's how we're massively expanding what we've done across each different media platform. You can please share the video. You can listen to the podcast, but press like, subscribe, leave your comments. Speaking a bit.